Welcome to Rhapsody in 35mm, where we attempt to illuminate the shadows of the past and shine a light on the dark corners of film history. In this introductory season of our podcast, we are going to discuss the history of horror on film. I will discuss where horror elements originated, how the genre developed, and where and how various films were influenced by one another. So come with me on a journey where we trace the development of horror on film. Join me.
If you dare. And away we go.
Good evening. I'm your host, Catherine Goshen. Episode 9, The Brighton School and the Intersection of Méliès, Smith, and Phalke. This is the penultimate episode of our 6-part series on spiritualism and G.A. Smith, where we explore spiritualism and its role in shaping the horror genre, as well as the life of filmmaker, color film developer, and Society for Psychical Research member G.A. Smith, whose early work as a mesmerist and telepathist informed his later work as a filmmaker. In this episode, we will continue to explore the films of G.A. Smith, as well as fellow Brighton filmmaker James Williamson, who were both part of what academics would later refer to as the Brighton School. We will examine how many creators of trick films share a background in magic, including Smith, Méliès, and Dadasaheb Phalke, whom we also briefly discuss. Additionally, we discuss producer and distributor Charles Urban, who distributed the films of G.A. Smith, James Williamson, and Georges Méliès, and the public's growing interest in actuaries, which were sort of like short documentaries, culminating in our examination of the Charles Urban and Georges Méliès actuary, The Coronation of Edward VII, on which G.A. Smith may have also collaborated. James Williamson and George Albert Smith are two of the most influential members of the film pioneers associated with what French film historian Georges Sadoul would later call the Brighton School, though Ronald S. Liebrach would later dismiss the term as, quote, a convenience for later commentators, end quote. The other two filmmakers normally associated with the Brighton School are Esme Collings and Alfred Darling. Alfred Darling, as we have already mentioned, was the Brighton-based engineer who invented the biocam and sold G.A. Smith his first camera. The Brighton School of filmmakers seems to mostly be defined by the fact that all members were active around the same time and in the same area, though David Fisher points out that most of this work was filmed in Hove rather than Brighton. Indeed, groups of independent film producers were active in many parts of England, as London was not the centralized seat of British film production until around 1915. James Williamson himself stated that he believed it was a coincidence that they were all active in Brighton at the same time. While Brighton owed much of its use as a filming location to its natural beauty, Williamson stated that the key ingredient in allowing the Brighton-based filmmakers to progress in the medium was the assistance of Alfred Darling, whom Williamson calls, quote, a clever engineer who made a study of the requirements of film producers, end quote. Williamson claims that it was only after meeting Darling that his filmmaking began in earnest. Instead, the fundamental connection between many of the English filmmakers of the early years of cinema seems to be American-born film producer and distributor Charles Urban. In fact, Urban was also associated with Georges Méliès, being the English distributor of Méliès's films and collaborating with him on a film production. And it was through that film production that George Albert Smith was able to work with Méliès. Charles Urban was a Cincinnati-born entrepreneur who, in 1895, came to manage a kinetoscope photograph parlor in Detroit, before acquiring the Michigan rights to the Edison Vitascope the following year. While touring Michigan and staging exhibitions of Edison Vitascope films, he modified a Vitascope to increase the capacity of the take-up reel, or the reel that gathers up the film that has already been projected. Urban then commissioned New York phonograph engineer Walter Isaacs to create a hand-crank projector that integrated the Urban-designed higher-capacity take-up reel, with the use of the hand crank allowing the projector to be operated without the use of electricity. This projector became known as the Bioscope and was completed in 1897, the same year that Urban left the U.S. In August of that year, Urban became the manager of the London office of the New York-based firm Maguire & Bacchus, which had gained the exclusive rights to sell and exhibit Edison's kinetoscopes and kinetoscope films in Mexico, the West Indies, Australia, South America, Europe, and Asia. In late 1894, Maguire and Bacchus also established the Continental Commerce Company, which handled their business in Africa, Europe, and Asia, and this was the name under which Maguire and Bacchus did business in England. Only a month after taking over the London office, Urban moved the Continental Commerce Company to Warwick Court in London. In December of that year, Maguire and Bacchus found itself at the center of a lawsuit brought by Edison for infringement of his motion picture patents. The following May, Urban reincorporated the Continental Commerce Company as the Warwick Trading Company, naming it after its location at Warwick Court, as he believed it to be, quote, a good solid British name, end quote. During the same period, Urban began making important business connections, one of whom was Cecil Hepworth. Urban commissioned Hepworth, at the time an inventor of photographic equipment, to fix some remaining issues with his projector at the bioscope. Hepworth would later become an influential filmmaker. According to Dr. Simon Brown, Associate Professor of Film and Television at Kingston University, London, quote, a producer, director, writer, and scenic photographer, Cecil Hepworth survived in the film business longer than any other British pioneer filmmaker. In the course of his career, Hepworth became one of the most respected, if not the most dynamic, figures in British cinema, end quote. The London-born Cecil Hepworth was the son of noted magic lantern showman Thomas Cradock Hepworth, often credited as T.C. Hepworth. T.C. Hepworth is also who, incidentally, succeeded John Henry Pepper, the showman who popularized Pepper's Ghost, when Pepper fell out with the governing board at the Royal Polytechnic on Regent Street in London. 1898 proved to be an important year for Charles Urban, for not only was he manufacturing his Hepworth-modified bioscope, but he also acquired Alfred Darling's Biocam. But much more importantly, this is when he secured the distribution rights to important filmmakers, such as George Albert Smith, James Williamson, and Georges Méliès. As the turn of the century was approaching, filmmaking was changing in fundamental ways. By 1905, the age of the Nickelodeon was dawning, and as the late film historian and writer Carlos Clarence stated, quote, trickery for the sake of trickery lost much of its allure during the Nickelodeon era, end quote. The spectacles that were the basis for trick films had grown out of the magic lantern tradition. During the first few years of motion pictures' existence, no subject was necessary. Just the wonder of seeing images move was enough for the audience. As the filmmaker James Williamson later stated, quote, the subject did not matter. To see waves dashing over rocks in a most natural way, to see a train arriving and people walking about as if alive, was admitted to be very wonderful, end quote. According to Tim Gunning, Professor Emeritus of Art History, Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Chicago, trick films are, quote, a series of displays, of magical attractions, rather than a primitive sketch of narrative continuity. Such viewing experiences related more to the attractions of the fairground than to the attractions of the legitimate theater, and reveal a fascination with the thrill of display rather than the construction of a story, end quote. During this period, moving pictures competed with music hall and fairground attractions, as well as various photographic attractions, such as the Magic Lantern Show. Cecil Hepworth, who had grown up with his father presenting magic lantern shows at the Royal Polytechnic on Regent Street in London, remembered the thrill of viewing the attractions at Marlborough Hall and the theatre alongside it. Dr. Helen Groth of the University of New South Wales notes when discussing Cecil Hepworth's autobiography, Came the Dawn, that the theatre, quote, included a projection room that spanned the whole width of the theatre at dress circle level and contained upwards of 15 limelight magic lanterns of various sizes set up to project a mixture of large painted and photographic slides, as well as trick slides of revolving geometrical patterns that created the illusion of movement on the screen. There was also a curious device known as a choreotoscope that Hepworth notes anticipated the modern cinematograph, end quote. As a side note, the choreotoscope was a magic lantern type of mechanism, popular from about 1866 to 1880, that contained 6 glass plate slides. These slides, which contained drawings, often skeletons, on a black background, were then mounted on a projector with a Maltese cross intermittent movement mechanism, which allowed the slides to change in quick succession. This projector was the first to use an intermittent movement, and this system would become the basis for cinema-based cameras and projectors. Moving pictures had to compete with these types of well-known and loved theatrical spectacles. As the filmmaker James Williamson later commented, quote, it has to be remembered that the public, up to this date, had been accustomed to looking at lantern slides of exquisite photographic quality, single pictures upon which much time and skill had been spent. It was not easy to persuade people that photographs fit to look at could be produced by the yard by simply turning a handle." End quote. When showing films during his early traveling showman days, Cecil Hepworth almost seemed to act as a modern DJ in terms of interpreting and mixing the demonstration of the films as DJs do with records. Quote, "Though my first attempts at the traveling show business consisted of a half a dozen 40-foot films from R.W. Paul's junk basket, plus a little music and 100 or so lantern slides, it required considerable ingenuity to spin that material out to an evening's entertainment. I showed the films forwards in the ordinary way and then showed some of them backwards. I stopped them in the middle and argued with them. I called out to the little girl who was standing in the forefront of the picture to stand aside, which she immediately did. That required careful timing but was very effective. But with it all, I soon found I must have more films and better ones." End quote. Because of this, many of those who produced trick films and were active during the early years of film had backgrounds as magicians, theatrical showmen, and magic lantern lecturers. This was not simply a background of filmmakers in the West. D.G. Phalke, popularly referred to as Dadasaheb Phalke, is often considered the father of Indian cinema. Phalke was responsible for the first Indian feature film and claimed credit for the birth of the Indian film industry, a claim which film scholar Ashish Rajadiaksha states, quote, "is hardly an exaggeration," end quote. Like Méliès and Smith, Phalke had a background in magic and theatrics, among other pursuits. Then, at the age of 40, as Méliès and Smith had experienced at an exhibition of the Lumiere brothers' cinematograph 14 years prior, Phalke had an experience that changed his life. Of his viewing of the life of Christ by French female pioneering director Alice Guy Blanchet, Phalke later stated, quote, "That day marked the beginning of a revolutionary change in my life. That day also marked the foundation in India of an industry which occupies the 5th place in the myriad of big and small professions that exist. While the life of Christ was rolling before my eyes, I was mentally visualizing the gods Sri Krishna, Sri Ramachandra, their Gokul, and Ayodhya. Could we, the sons of India, ever be able to see Indian images on the screen?" End quote. While initially filming trick films, like Growth of a Pea Plant, Phalke traveled to London in 1912, where he met Cecil Hepworth, who had established his own film studios in 1899. Hepworth showed Phalke his studio and illustrated the film equipment, recommending to Phalke that he purchase such equipment if he wanted to begin making films. While in England, Phalke purchased a perforator, Kodak stock, and a Williamson camera, manufactured by the filmmaker James Williamson, who in 1910 had begun to focus on manufacturing film equipment. And, like many of his Western counterparts, Phalke found himself neglected by the very industry which he nurtured and helped to establish. Forgotten, penniless, and bitter at the time of his death, Phalke stated, quote, "I am very much disappointed about the creations of Indian film industry. With what ideals and with what long, drawn-out suffering I built up this indigenous industry, and what it is my misfortune to see today." End quote. However, more than 25 years after Dadasaheb Phalke's death, the National Film Awards, India's most prestigious cinema-related awards ceremony, named their Lifetime Achievement Award in his honor. By the turn of the century, a focus on the narrative instead of the pure spectacle of trick films was quickly becoming the standard, as evidenced by the increasing commonality of the multi-shot film. These shots existed to mediate and enhance the telling of the story, rather than to impress its audience as another visual trick. This era of transition between the age of trick films and the Nickelodeon era found that while films were advancing in many ways, especially technically, narratively, many were still stuck in the past of the magic lantern shows. For example, James Williamson's 1901 three-shot trick film, The Big Swallow, while hailed by film historian and writer Michael Brooke as, quote, "one of the most important early British films in that it was one of the first to deliberately exploit the contrast between the eye of the camera and the audience watching the final film," end quote. As it is described in Williamson's sales catalog, shows the film's reliance on and the necessity of exhibitors narrating and explaining the actions in the film as would have been done in a magic lantern lecture. For films to progress, the narrative would instead need to be communicated to the audience via cinematic devices, such as shots, editing, and angles that control and manipulate the audience's attention, which Tim Gunning notes are techniques of the, quote, "classical system of continuity," end quote. As stated by Tim Gunning, quote, "the classical film can absorb sudden, ubiquitous switches in viewpoint into an act of storytelling, creating a cinema whose role is less to display than articulate a story. The continuity of classic cinema is based on the coherence of the story, and the spectator's identification with the camera is mediated through an engagement with the unfolding of the story." End quote. However, some filmmakers, like George Albert Smith and James Williamson, began to transition into other parts of the film business, which eventually overtook their directing efforts. Already in 1898, the same year that he made Santa Claus and Photographing a Ghost, Smith was also processing and printing film for fellow filmmakers like James Williamson and for Charles Urban's Warwick Trading Company, along with numerous others. While Smith's success in film during this period meant that in late 1898 and early 1899, his films were presented alongside Georges Méliès at the Alhambra Theatre in Brighton, Smith's simultaneous success with the Warwick Trading Company meant that by 1900 the company helped to finance the construction of a film studio at St. Anne's Well Gardens. Offered a 2-year contract by the Warwick Trading Company, Smith was described that year in their catalogue as, quote, "the manager of the Brighton film works of the Warwick Trading Company," end quote. This is also the year that Smith produced, among other films, As Seen Through a Telescope and Grandma's Reading Glass. In January of 1901, Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom died, and Britain entered the Edwardian era. The coronation of Edward VII and his queen consort, Alexandra, took place over a year and a half after Queen Victoria's death, on August 9, 1902, at Westminster Abbey. This would be the first coronation in over 60 years. For royal context, the new king, Edward VII, the son of Queen Victoria, was the grandfather of George VI, who was portrayed on screen by Colin Firth in The King's Speech, and of the scandalous Edward VIII, known after his abdication as the Duke of Windsor. And for those not up on their modern British royal family history, that means that Edward VII was the late Queen Elizabeth II's great-grandfather. Though the official website of the British royal family claims that, quote, "the coronation of the new sovereign follows some months after his or her accession, following a brief period of mourning and as a result of the enormous amount of preparation required to organize the ceremony," end quote, I see no instance of a coronation taking place less than a year after the previous monarch's death since the coronation of George IV in 1821, which took place a year and a half after he acceded to the throne, though George VI did hold his coronation within a year of his brother's abdication. And if the current monarch, Charles III, has his coronation as scheduled on March 6, 2023, 8 months after his mother, Queen Elizabeth II's death, he will be the first British monarch to have his or her coronation within a year of his or her predecessor's death in over 200 years. As in modern times, the British royal family of the Victorian and Edwardian eras seem to have had an innate understanding of the power of the media and, as her Diamond Jubilee approached in 1897, Queen Victoria showed an astute understanding of public image and the power of photography and film. For example, for her official portrait, she chose a photograph taken 4 years earlier. While Queen Victoria required the name of the photographer be cited whenever the photograph was used, she also had the copyright removed, allowing her image to be put on an infinite variety of products and items for mass consumption, quote, "from biscuit tins to tea towels," end quote, and ensuring her image was ubiquitous. On June 22, 1897, 3 million people gathered to watch the Queen's procession, with cameramen placed at various points on the 6-mile route to fully capture the event. Robert W. Paul, the inventor of the theatrograph, which we briefly discussed in Episode 1 as being the first motion picture bought by Méliès, was one of the many filmmakers present at the Jubilee, an experience about which Paul later stated, quote, "Large sums were paid for suitable camera positions, several of which were secured for my operators. I myself operated a camera perched on a narrow ledge in the churchyard," end quote. These types of films are known as actualities, and, according to the late film historian, John Barnes, quote, "these films complemented news coverage of the events represented, and provided a visual corollary to the descriptions in the popular press. Like the panoramas, dioramas, and wax museums of the late 19th century, they were not so much sources of news in themselves as representations of current events already familiar from other sources," end quote. The response from the crowd upon seeing the Queen during her procession was surprising to and overwhelming for her, as she wrote in her diary, quote, "No one ever, I believe, has met with such an ovation as was given to me, passing through those 6 miles of streets, including Constitution Hill. The crowds were quite indescribable and their enthusiasm truly marvelous and deeply touching. The cheering was quite deafening, and every face seemed to be filled with real joy. I was much moved and gratified." End quote. Films of the Queen's Jubilee proved to be very popular and profitable for film producers and distributors, and became a focal point of many film exhibitions. The effect of the Jubilee being filmed and exhibited was to allow those who were normally unable to witness such an event, such as the disabled and or the poor, and particularly those living in remote locations, to experience an occasion of national importance and afford them a sense of participation and national identity. Fairground exhibitors, which catered to the poor in rural and or industrial areas, found film of the Jubilee to be so popular that they were forced to increase the number of showings. The late film historian John Barnes states, quote, "Exhibition sites varied in scale from grand bioscope shows in tents capable of holding as many as 500 spectators to peep show street cinematographs with eyepieces for 20 people." End quote. Even this early in film's history, royal patronages were being sought by film producers and partnerships for exclusive access and rights were already being formed. British inventor William Dixon, who had invented the kinetoscope for Edison, had helped to form the American Mutoscope and Biograph Company in 1895, before returning to Britain 2 years later to work for its British branch. Approximately a decade later, the company would be known as the simpler Biograph Company, and is remembered as the studio for whom D.W. Griffith, Mary Pickford, and Lillian Gish, among others, worked. On the Prince of Wales receiving the honor of the Order of Bath, a banquet was held, after which the British Mutoscope and Biograph Company was invited to St. James Palace to present an exhibition of films, including parts of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee procession. According to film scholar Ian Christie, quote, "The British Mutoscope and Biograph appears to have adopted a deliberate policy of courting royal relationships, possibly in order to counteract the dubious reputation of its mutoscope subjects, which often featured titillating images of glamorous women. In the summer of 1897, the record of afternoon tea in the gardens of Clarence House shows 3 generations of the royal family at a garden party with what Richard Browne and Barry Anthony termed startling informality. British Bioscope's relationship with the royal family continued to bear fruit after the St. James's Palace showing. They filmed the Queen laying the foundation stone of the Victoria and Albert Museum on 17 May 1899, while a biograph show was given at Sandringham on 29 June. And in the summer of 1900, Biograph filmed what is probably the most important of the early intimate royal films, Children of the Royal Family of England, which showed our future king at play, namely Prince Edward of York, later Edward VIII. This 2-part film, made over 2 mornings, was a major success for the company, becoming an extremely popular item in Biograph programs at the Palace Theatre, and later on their home viewing system, the Kenora. The Biograph's relationship with the future king, Prince Albert, soon to be Edward VII, would continue as they filmed many events throughout his reign." End quote. This presented film producers from competing companies with a problem, as the British Mutoscope and Biograph Company had exclusive rights to film the coronation inside Westminster Abbey. The answer as to how to compete with British Mutoscope and Biograph? A reconstructed actuality, also known as a reconstructed newsreel, like what we know today as a docudrama. In 1902, Urban's success with the Warwick Trading Company led him to open a Paris branch. Again, Urban was already associated with Monterey, based on Georges Méliès, as the English distributor of his films. Georges Méliès had been creating reconstructed actuality since 1897, with a series based on the Dreyfus affair, which were sympathetic in its presentation of Dreyfus, being among Méliès's best known. Méliès's sympathetic portrayal served as powerful propaganda, as many actualities and reconstructed actualities did, and as many films, such as Casablanca, still do, though it wasn't the content of the images as much as the context of the exhibition that were propagandistic. Nonetheless, so divisive was public opinion regarding Dreyfus that fights broke out in the audience during exhibitions of Méliès's film. The French government ended up banning Méliès's film series, as well as one produced by Phalke, and hindered its distribution internationally, though probably more to protect its own reputation amid national and international outcry and charges of anti-Semitism. Urban tackled the challenge of competing with the British Mutoscope and Biograph by commissioning the great Méliès to create a reconstructed actuality of Edward VII's upcoming coronation. According to Dr. Richard Abel, Professor Emeritus of International Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Michigan, the coronation of Edward VII, quote, was quite different from Le Faire Dreyfus and much closer to the tableau vivant style that would soon characterize the historical film." End quote. While Méliès is today famous for his fanciful sets and creative details, historical accuracy was of the utmost importance to compete with the mutoscope and biographs footage of the actual coronation. Indeed, Méliès and his co-producer were so determined to create an authentic representation of the event that they even visited Westminster Abbey, which Méliès then attempted to faithfully recreate at his own greenhouse-like studio in Montreuil. After all, if Méliès could create military reenactments of the Greco-Turkish War in a Parisian garden, he could certainly recreate Westminster Abbey within the confines of his studio. Additionally, Urban insisted on the use of his own camera, the bioscope, during the production of this film. As this was a pre-enactment, having been filmed prior to the actual coronation, to be printed and shipped to exhibitors in time for its premiere on the date of the actual coronation on the 26th of June, Méliès had to depend on the ritual of the ceremony to anticipate the actions of the British royals. Ever the world of make-believe that filmmaking is, the actor playing the new king was in actuality a washroom attendant, cast for his supposed likeness to Edward VII. According to multiple sources, including former editor of Screen Digest, David Fisher, and film critic and author David Robinson, George Albert Smith worked with Méliès on this film. Indeed, Dr. Frank Gray states that Méliès and Smith were acquaintances who corresponded with one another during this period. But I am unable to clarify exactly what function Smith served in the making of this film, especially considering that, at this point in his life, Smith was a successful businessman, showman, and filmmaker with his own studio and lab. However, as this film was an international co-production commissioned by Urban on behalf of the Warwick Trading Company, I'm guessing that Smith was involved in relation to his role as the manager of the Brighton film works of the Warwick Trading Company, which is how Smith was listed in the Warwick Trading Company's catalog. I speculate that, perhaps, Smith acted as a representative of Urban and the company in this international co-production and functioned in an intermediary role, a role that would have benefited from Smith and Méliès's acquaintanceship. As Urban even wanted his own camera used in the filming, perhaps Smith monitored the production and assisted with the use of Urban's film equipment. This would also allow an Englishman to monitor for cultural considerations. Whatever the case may be, the film was ready for exhibition by the coronation's date on the 26th of June, when, 3 days before the coronation was to occur, and therefore the film's premiere, an announcement was made by the palace that the coronation was being delayed. The 60-year-old Edward VII had been stricken with appendicitis. The coronation finally occurred a month and a half later, on the 9th of August, with Méliès's film premiering that same day, headlining at the Alhambra Music Hall in Leicester Square in London. Urban bookended the film with actual footage of the royal coach's arrival and departure to complete the pseudo-newsreel quality. An immediate hit, Méliès and Urban's The Coronation of Edward VII made the rounds on the Empire Palace Music Hall circuit in England before embarking on a world tour as ostensibly the first royal documentary. According to Ian Christie, quote, Urban's investment in this coverage, and that of the other companies, confirmed that the advent of the photographic image, both still and moving, had made the British monarchy a highly marketable spectacle, end quote. Beyond making the coronation of Edward VII, 1902 was a peak year for both Méliès and Smith, with Smith also producing Mary Jane's Mishap, while Méliès produced his well-remembered and beloved A Trip to the Moon. But by the following year, events were beginning to transpire that would affect the future of not only Méliès, Smith, and Urban, but of filmmaking itself. Join us for episode 10 for the exciting conclusion to this 6-part series on spiritualism and filmmaker G.A. Smith. If you would like a list of sources for this episode, as well as other supplemental material, check out our website at rhapsodyin35mm podcast.com. That's Rhapsody in 35mm podcast.com. When you visit, make sure to subscribe so you can be notified of new episodes and postings. You can also stay connected with us via our social media platforms, such as Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Rhapsody in 35mm. Or drop us a line with any questions or suggestions at rhapsodyin35mm@gmail.com. Please rate us on Apple Podcasts, because that is a great way for others to find us. Special thanks to Simon Ballantoy for playing and recording Harry L. Tyler's X-Ray Waltzes. To listen to the full recording, please visit our website. Rhapsody in 35mm is researched, written, co-produced and narrated by me, Catherine Goshen. The show is edited and co-produced by Johnny Goshen, who also designed the show logo, website, and takes care of social media. Research assistants are Penny and Sherman Bouts. Until next time, thanks for listening.